Hi everyone! Today I'll be discussing the article Rogelio DiazGuerrero, Pioneer of Latin American Psychology, written by his son Rolando Diaz-Levin. Rogelio DiazGuerrero was a Mexican psychologist born in Guadalajara, Mexico in 1918. He became interested in psychology at a young age when one of his professors briefly discussed the topic. However, at the time, there was very little opportunity to study psychology in Mexico. Instead, he was advised to pursue a career in medicine with a focus in psychiatry. Lucky for Rogelio, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM, added a master's in psychology program while he was attending medical school there. After studying at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Rogelio moved to the United States and completed both a master's and doctorate in neuropsychiatry and psychology at the University of Iowa. His time in the United States, as well as a cross-cultural marriage to an Australian woman, Ethno Loving, informed his work and emphasized the importance of a cross-cultural lens in psychology to him. Overall, Rogelio DiazGuerrero was an extremely hard worker, publishing books and articles on cross-cultural psychology up until his death in 2004 at the age of 86. In fact, according to his son, he was still actively working on a research project about the impact of culture on development at the time of his death. As the title of this article suggests, Rogelio was a pioneer of Latin American and cultural psychology. He understood the importance of studying the impact of culture and behavior long before the field was integrated into more quote-unquote mainstream psychology. As I understand it, his study of cultural psychology occurred generally in three waves, each one leading to and influencing the next. Much of his early work centered around cross-cultural psychology. Now, to my understanding, his work was different than the cross-cultural psychological practices that we've often critiqued in class this semester. He did not aim to establish a certain norm in order to compare the behavior of other cultures to this standard, but instead, he was one of the first psychologists to acknowledge that culture does, in fact, influence human behavior and personality. Instead of establishing a comparative norm, I interpret his work as actually an argument against a universal norm because Rogelio understood that behavior and personality differed between groups of people due to their culture. And while some of his work does compare different cultures, which I'll explain later, he focused most of his research on Mexico and Mexican-specific culture. His initial focus on cross-cultural psychology led to the second stage of his work, in which he researched a concept entitled Historic Sociocultural Premises. Historic sociocultural premises, as defined by Rogelio, are basically norms, different in each culture, that underlie and regulate behavior. So first, Rogelio established the broader concept of cross-cultural studies, and next he narrowed his work to focus on a specific aspect of the discipline. Finally, both his work in cross-cultural psychology and his focus on historic sociocultural premises eventually culminated in a new branch of psychology, Ethno Psychology, or the psychology and behavior of an ethnic group. And as I've mentioned, Rogelio focused the majority of his research on Mexican culture. That was the framework for his studies. Now we're going to dive a little bit deeper on each of these three topics. Rogelio specifically focused his cross-cultural research on examining the impact of culture on behavior. He not only conducted research on this topic, but he was also integral in generating definitions and quote-unquote objective measuring instruments. I'll come back to the whole quote-unquote objective measuring instruments question later on. His cross-cultural research is perhaps most apparent in his book, Personality Development in Two Cultures, which was released in 1975. The book was based on a comparative research study of 400 children in Mexico and 400 children in the United States. Using a cross-sequential design, groups of children starting in first grade through their junior year of high school were followed longitudinally for 6 years. Personalities and behavior were measured using tests like the WISC, WACE, the Perceptual Maturity Test, and the Test Anxiety Scale for Children, among others. Of course, as we've discussed in class, it's important to keep in mind who these tests were designed by and for when analyzing results. But overall, conclusions of the study included that children in Mexico tended to be more family-centered than children in the United States, children in Mexico tended to be more cooperative than children in the United States, and children in Mexico tended to be more pessimistic than children in the United States. Although the methodology is definitely up for debate due to the use of personality and intelligence testing that was most likely biased towards the children in the United States, this research project was still fairly groundbreaking for its time due to its focus on the impact of culture. After this comparative study, Rogelio shifted to almost exclusively focus his work on Mexican culture. Using research based on the concept of historic sociocultural premises, he established basic principles of traditional Mexican culture in relation to family dynamics especially. The first principle was the power and supremacy of the father figure in the family. The second principle was the sacrifice and love of the mother figure in the family. Rogelio also found two further dimensions of these principles based off the historic sociocultural premises. A familial dimension called affiliative obedience versus active self-affirmation, and a gender dimension called machismo versus abnegation virginity. In his book, A Factorial Scale of Historical Sociocultural Premises of the Mexican Family, released in 1972, Rogelio outlines that the affiliative obedience versus active self-affirmation dimension describes the hierarchical relationships in many Mexican families wherein children must always obey their parents, especially respecting their father and loving their mother. In turn, parents must always protect and take care of their children. Through his work, Rogelio argues that these dimensions, based on historic sociocultural premises, show why the family and the value of collectivism might hold more significance in Mexican families than in other cultures. The gender dimension, machismo versus abnegation virginity, further details the sacrifice of the mother and female figure in Mexican culture. Although the concept of abnegation, or sacrifice for the larger community, is prevalent for all members of Mexican families according to Rogelio, the mother figure and female figure especially make sacrifices by putting others' needs above their own. Basically, abnegation, or sacrifice, is performed by everyone in Mexican culture and families, but is especially relevant to the mother and female figures. In turn, their abnegation works to uphold the often patriarchal family hierarchy. To summarize, Rogelio argues that the Mexican culture internalizes these premises that highlight the importance of abnegation, which in turn make them more likely to demonstrate abnegation, which then forms and reinforces the hierarchical structure of their community. Much of Rogelio's work culminated in the development of a new branch of psychology called Ethno Psychology. Ethno Psychology, generally, focuses on studying the specific psychology and behavior of one ethnic group. Rogelio's vision of Ethno Psychology analyzed different forms of human ecosystems, and he was specifically focused on personality development. Rogelio believed that each culture develops its own ecosystem, and that each ecosystem is extremely different and unique from every other ecosystem. He argued that the origin of most human differences, especially regarding personality, was derived from differences within the ecosystems people grew up in. And he detailed this philosophy in his book, Psicología del Mexicano, Descubrimiento de la Etnopsicología. I believe Rogelio's greatest legacy was popularizing the sociocultural psychological perspective and specifically focusing on Mexican psychology. In doing so, as his son Rolando writes, he paved the way for other indigenous psychologists. He also created Ethno Psychology. Now, based on my internet searching in order to prepare for this presentation, it seems as if Ethno Psychology has morphed into a form of psychology called psychological anthropology today. But even though it might not stand on its own as its separate psychological branch, its premise still seems to inform other kinds of psychology, like cultural psychology today. Finally, Rogelio published a culmination of his life's work in his book, Under the Claws of Culture, in 2002. He died only 2 years after its release, and that book can be seen on this slide. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I have a few final questions to ask everyone. First, do you support Rogelio's research project, Personality Development in Two Cultures? It was an acclaimed cultural study, as I mentioned, but it also employed a cross-cultural approach that utilized bias measurement tools we've previously criticized in class. If a study has good intentions, is it ever okay to utilize bias measurement tools like the WISC and WAIST intelligence tests for research? Second, the article claims that Rogelio adapted quote-unquote objective measuring instruments for research in cultural psychology. However, after further research, I couldn't really figure out what these quote-unquote objective instruments are. Do you think it's possible to have a truly objective measurement in psychology, especially when studying culture? And last, given Rogelio's theory about ecosystems and how they shape culture, what do you think his stance would be in the nature versus nurture debate that we've discussed so much in class this semester? Thank you for listening. I hope you're all doing well.